There are discoveries that arrive not through deliberate seeking, but through the quiet persistence of coincidence. Such was my encounter with the Whitley family, a name that first appeared to me in the mundane setting of an estate sale advertisement buried among the classified listings of a Vermont newspaper from October of last year. The advertisement itself was unremarkable, another colonial mansion clearing its contents before transfer to new ownership. Yet one phrase caught my attention with the peculiar weight that certain words carry when they brush against something we cannot yet name: unusual inheritance protocols. As a genealogist specializing in New England family histories, I have grown accustomed to the eccentricities that accumulate in old bloodlines like dust in abandoned rooms. Families develop their rituals, their private mythologies, their careful arrangements for passing wealth and memory from one generation to the next. But the Whitley name stirred something deeper than professional curiosity. In my preliminary research, conducted from the comfortable distance of online archives and digitized records, I discovered a pattern of documentation that defied the usual logic of family succession. The record showed a family of considerable means stretching back to the early 19th century, their fortune built upon what the documents described as endowments from benefactors unknown. More intriguing still were the inconsistencies in the inheritance records themselves. Unlike most families of their station, where property passed predictably from father to eldest son, the Whitley estate seemed to change hands according to no discernible pattern. Sons inherited over fathers, distant cousins superseded direct descendants, and in several instances, family members who had been designated as heirs simply vanished from all subsequent documentation. The town clerk's office in Millbrook, Vermont, provided additional fragments of this puzzling genealogy. Death certificates that listed causes as natural decline for individuals in their 20s. Marriage records that showed unions lasting mere months before one spouse disappeared without legal dissolution. Birth certificates for children whose names never appeared in school enrollment records or any other documentation of their existence. Each document felt genuine in isolation, yet together they formed a portrait of a family that seemed to exist at the very edges of verifiable reality. It was the discovery of a newspaper clipping from 1987 that transformed my academic interest into something approaching compulsion. The brief article, tucked away in the local news section, reported the disappearance of Margaret Whitley, described as the last known member of the family. The article mentioned that she had been living alone on the family estate, maintaining what it called traditional family observances until her unexplained absence was discovered by a caretaker. What struck me most profoundly was a single sentence near the article's end. Miss Whitley had recently expressed concerns about family obligations that she described as impossible to fulfill and impossible to escape. The weight of that phrase, impossible to fulfill and impossible to escape, settled into my thoughts with the persistence of a half-remembered melody. I found myself returning to it during the ordinary moments of daily life, turning it over like a coin in my pocket, wondering what obligation could carry such finality, such hopeless precision. And it was then, in that moment of metaphorical thinking, that I realized I had been approaching the Whitley mystery from entirely the wrong direction. I had been searching for logical explanations for illogical events when perhaps the events themselves contain their own internal logic, one that operated according to rules I had not yet learned to recognize. The decision to travel to Vermont to see the Whitley estate with my own eyes felt both inevitable and slightly mad. Yet there are moments in any serious research when documents cease to be sufficient, when the truth of a matter requires physical presence, the testimony of one's own senses. As I prepared for the journey, I could not shake the feeling that I was crossing some invisible boundary, moving from the safe realm of historical inquiry into something far more immediate and far less predictable. The drive to Millbrook took me through the kind of New England countryside that exists in a perpetual state of gentle decay. October had dressed the landscape in its most deceptive beauty, the maples blazing scarlet against gray stone walls, the air carrying that particular crispness that makes mortality seem like a distant, almost quaint concern. Yet as I turned onto the unmarked road that led to the Whitley property, the beauty began to take on a different quality, as if the very trees were whispering warnings that I lacked the wisdom to understand. The estate occupied a hollow between two low hills, positioned in such a way that it seemed to exist in permanent shadow, even on the brightest days. The approach road curved through a tunnel of overhanging branches that had grown together over decades of neglect, creating a natural archway that filtered the afternoon light into fragments of gold and green. The effect was beautiful and unsettling in equal measure, like stepping into a photograph that had been left too long in the sun. The house itself materialized gradually through the trees, revealing itself piece by piece as the road descended into the hollow. It was a structure of considerable ambition, built in the Georgian style with the kind of precise symmetry that speaks of wealth applied with mathematical certainty. 3 stories of weathered brick rose from a foundation of local granite, the windows arranged in perfect order across the facade like eyes that had been watching the road for far too long. The roofline was broken by dormers and chimneys that seemed to multiply as I studied them, as if the house were adding new features to itself in the moments when I wasn't looking directly at it. But it was the condition of the property that spoke most eloquently of the family's fate. The gardens that had once demonstrated the Whitley prosperity had surrendered to wilderness years ago, leaving only the bones of formal landscaping visible beneath the tangle of volunteer growth. Box hedges had grown into grotesque shapes, their careful geometry lost to time and weather. The gravel drive was barely navigable, broken by frost heaves and colonized by moss that gave it the appearance of an ancient riverbed rather than a path meant for carriages and motor cars. I parked beside a stone fountain that had been dry for so long that small trees had taken root in its basin. The silence that greeted me when I turned off the engine was profound in the way that only truly isolated places can achieve. It was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of a kind of listening quiet, as if the very air were paying attention to my arrival. The caretaker who met me at the front door was a man named Thomas Hartwell, whose family had been maintaining the property since Margaret Whitley's disappearance. He was perhaps 60 years old, with the kind of weathered face that comes from decades of outdoor work, but his eyes held a wariness that seemed to have nothing to do with physical labor. When I introduced myself and explained my interest in the family's history, his expression shifted in a way that suggested my arrival was not entirely unexpected. "Researchers come through every few years," he said, his voice carrying the flat vowels of rural Vermont. "Usually don't stay long once they get inside." He produced a set of keys from his jacket pocket, heavy iron things that looked old enough to have been forged by the house's original builders. "You're welcome to look around, but I'd appreciate it if you kept to the main floors during daylight hours. The basement stairs aren't what they used to be, and the electrical system down there has been acting peculiar." As he unlocked the front door, Hartwell paused with his hand on the knob. "One more thing," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "If you hear sounds after dark, creaking, footsteps, that sort of thing, it's just the house settling. Old places make their own noises. No need to investigate." The way he said it carried the weight of personal experience, and I found myself wondering what sounds he had investigated and what he had found. The door opened onto an entrance hall that retained enough of its original grandeur to suggest what the house had been in its prime. A staircase curved upward along the left wall, its mahogany banister worn smooth by generations of hands. The floor was inlaid parquet, intricate patterns of dark and light wood that drew the eye inward toward the heart of the house. But like everything else about the property, the grandeur was compromised by neglect. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling like strange flowers, and the wallpaper had begun to peel at the seams, revealing glimpses of older patterns beneath. "The family papers are mostly in the library," Hartwell said, gesturing toward a doorway to the right of the stairs. "Margaret spent most of her time in there toward the end, reading through the old records, making notes. She seemed to be researching something, though she never said what." He handed me the keys, their weight cold and substantial in my palm. "I'll be back before sunset to lock up. Try not to wander too far from the main rooms." And with that he was gone, leaving me alone in the entrance hall with only the sound of my own breathing and the subtle creaking that old houses make as they shift and settle under the weight of their own history. I stood there for several minutes, allowing my eyes to adjust to the dim light that filtered through windows clouded by decades of neglect. The silence was different from what I had experienced outside. Not the listening quiet of the natural world, but something more expectant, as if the house itself were waiting to see what I would do next. The Whitley library occupied what had once been a formal parlor, its walls lined with built-in shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. The books themselves were an eclectic collection spanning several centuries, from leather-bound volumes that might have been contemporary with the house's construction to more recent acquisitions that suggested reading tastes both scholarly and arcane. But it was the large mahogany desk positioned near the room's single window that drew my immediate attention, for its surface was covered with documents that had clearly been arranged by someone engaged in serious research. Margaret Whitley, it seemed, had been conducting her own investigation into the family history. The desk bore evidence of methodical scholarship. Index cards covered with notes in a careful feminine hand, photocopies of documents from various archives, and genealogical charts mapped out in different colored inks. At the center of this organized chaos sat a stack of ledgers bound in cracked leather, their spines marked with dates that stretched back to the family's earliest years in Vermont. I approached the desk with the reverence that such documents demand, aware that I was looking at the last work of a woman who had vanished without explanation nearly 4 decades ago. The topmost ledger bore the date, 1823, embossed in faded gold lettering. When I opened it, the pages exhaled a scent of old leather and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me unpleasantly of flowers left too long in a closed room. The ledger's pages were filled with entries written in various hands, suggesting that multiple generations had contributed to its contents. But unlike typical family records, which might document births, marriages, and deaths in straightforward chronological order, the Whitley ledger seemed concerned primarily with a single recurring event, what the entries termed the selection ceremony. The earliest entry, dated September 15, 1823, was written in the formal prose of the period. On this date, in accordance with the arrangement established by our benefactor, the selection of the heir to the Whitley holdings was conducted. Present were Josiah Whitley, father, Ezra Whitley, eldest son, age 22, and Samuel Whitley, youngest son, age 19. The ceremony proceeded according to the prescribed method, with the sacred coin determining that Samuel should assume the responsibilities of inheritance. Ezra has accepted this decision with appropriate grace and will remain to assist in the management of the estate until such time as Samuel assumes his full duties. I turned the page to find a follow-up entry dated exactly 1 year later. Samuel Whitley has today departed this earthly realm, having fulfilled his obligations to the arrangement. The estate passes now to Ezra, who accepts this burden with understanding of its requirements. We commend Samuel's soul to whatever rest awaits those who serve the greater design. The clinical language of these entries was more unsettling than explicit horror might have been. Here was a family that had developed a formal vocabulary for tragedy, a way of speaking about loss that suggested it was not loss at all but some kind of fulfillment. I found myself reading and rereading that phrase, having fulfilled his obligations to the arrangement, trying to understand what obligations could lead so directly to death, what arrangement could demand such precise timing. As I worked my way through the subsequent pages, a pattern emerged that was both consistent and increasingly disturbing. Each generation of Whitleys conducted their selection ceremony on the same date, September 15th, using what the ledger consistently referred to as the sacred coin. The chosen heir invariably died within 1 to 7 years of their selection, always with the same phrase recorded, having fulfilled his obligations to the arrangement. The surviving family members wrote of these deaths not with grief but with a kind of resigned acceptance, as if they were recording the completion of a business transaction rather than the loss of a loved one. What disturbed me most profoundly was the gradual realization that the family understood exactly what they were doing. This was not ignorance or superstition, but conscious participation in something they viewed as both necessary and inevitable. An entry from 1847 made this particularly clear. Young Catherine has inquired about the nature of the arrangement and why our family alone among those of our station must observe such customs. I have explained to her that the wealth which provides for our comfort and position comes with obligations that cannot be altered or abandoned. She seems to understand that comfort and terror are often inseparable companions. and that those who benefit from unusual circumstances must be prepared to pay unusual prices. The ledger for 1873 contained an entry that stopped my breath entirely. The ceremony this year was conducted in the presence of our benefactor, who appeared in the usual manner to witness the selection. Joshua Whitley was chosen, and our benefactor expressed satisfaction with the family's continued adherence to the terms established 50 years past. Joshua received the mark upon his left wrist and seemed to understand what it signified. He has requested that his final letter be sealed and not opened until after his departure, a request which we honor. I sat back in the leather chair, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to process what I had just read. The entry spoke of a benefactor who appeared in person, of marks upon the chosen heirs, of final letters written by people who knew they were going to die. This was not the gradual revelation of family tragedy, but evidence of something far more deliberate and far more monstrous. The later ledgers showed an evolution in the family's understanding of their situation. By the early 20th century, the entries had grown longer and more introspective, suggesting that each generation grappled more consciously with the moral implications of their inheritance. An entry from 1923 read, "We have become a family of murderers who kill with coins instead of knives, who sacrifice our children to maintain our comfort. Yet, what choice do we have? The arrangement cannot be broken, and the benefactor grows impatient when the ceremonies are delayed or conducted improperly. We are trapped in a web of prosperity that demands blood for its maintenance." The final ledger, covering the years from 1960 to 1987, showed Margaret Whitley's increasingly desperate attempts to understand and potentially break the family curse. Her handwriting appeared throughout, sometimes in the formal entries required by tradition, but increasingly in personal notes scrawled in the margins. "There must be a way out," she had written beside one entry. "No arrangement can be truly eternal. Every contract has its loopholes, every curse its weakness." Her final entry, dated September 10, 1987, just 5 days before that year's scheduled ceremony, consisted of a single sentence: "I have found the original covenant, and I finally understand what we have been feeding all these years." The portrait gallery occupied the entire length of the house's second floor, a corridor lined with paintings that documented 2 centuries of Whitley family history. In daylight filtered through tall windows, the collection might have appeared unremarkable, the usual parade of merchants and their wives, children and patriarchs, all rendered in the formal style that prosperity has always demanded of its artists. But as afternoon shadows began to gather in the corners of the hallway, the portraits revealed qualities that no conventional family gallery should possess. I had come upstairs following my discovery of the ledgers, driven by a need to put faces to the names I had been reading, to see if the physical record of the family might reveal truths that the written documents had obscured. What I found was more unsettling than I had prepared myself to encounter. The portraits were arranged chronologically, beginning with Josiah Whitley, the family patriarch, and proceeding through successive generations to the present. But it was not the progression of faces that disturbed me. It was the way certain paintings seemed to exist in subtle but unmistakable opposition to the others. The chosen heirs, and I knew them immediately, though I could not have explained how, were painted differently than their relatives. Not obviously so, not in any way that would be apparent to a casual observer, but with a precision of detail that suggested the artists had been working from particularly intimate knowledge of their subjects. Their eyes held a quality of awareness that went beyond the usual alertness of formal portraiture. They seemed to be looking not at the viewer but through them, as if they could see something approaching from a great distance. Samuel Whitley, the first chosen heir according to the ledgers, gazed out from his portrait with an expression that I initially mistook for contentment. He had been painted in his early 20s, wearing the kind of dark coat that suggested both prosperity and gravity. But the longer I studied his face, the more I realized that what I had taken for contentment was actually a kind of resigned knowledge. His slight smile contained no warmth, and his eyes held the particular sadness of someone who has learned a truth they wish they could forget. Moving down the corridor, I found Joshua Whitley, the heir chosen in 1873, whose selection had been witnessed by the mysterious benefactor. The artist had captured him in 3/4 profile, his left hand resting on the back of a chair in the conventional pose of formal portraiture, but on his exposed wrist, barely visible unless one knew to look for it, was a small mark that might have been a scar or birthmark. The ledger had mentioned that he had received the mark, and here was the physical evidence of whatever ceremony had bound him to his fate. Catherine Whitley, chosen in 1889, was the only woman among the selected heirs, and her portrait was perhaps the most disturbing of all. She had been painted in a white dress that emphasized her youth. She could not have been more than 20, but her expression was ancient with understanding. The artist had positioned her beside a window that looked out onto grounds that bore no resemblance to the Whitley estate. Instead, the landscape visible through the painted window was barren and strange, dominated by twisted trees that cast shadows in directions that defied the apparent position of the sun. What struck me most forcefully about these portraits was the way they seemed to interact with the light in the corridor. As the afternoon progressed and the shadows deepened, the paintings appeared to become more vivid, as if darkness revealed details that daylight had concealed. The chosen heir's eyes seemed to track movement, their expressions shifting subtly as I passed from one portrait to the next. I found myself checking over my shoulder repeatedly, unable to shake the sensation that I was being observed by more than painted eyes. It was while studying the portrait of Margaret Whitley that I experienced my first moment of genuine fear. She had been painted sometime in the 1980s, probably not long before her disappearance, and the artist had captured her with devastating honesty. This was not the formal idealization that characterized most of the other portraits, but a raw depiction of someone consumed by desperate knowledge. Her hair was pulled back severely, emphasizing the sharp angles of her face, and her eyes held a wildness that spoke of sleepless nights and terrible discoveries. But it was her hands that made me step backward involuntarily. Unlike the other portrayed heirs, whose hands were positioned in conventional poses, Margaret's were painted in the act of gripping something that the artist had chosen not to include in the painting. Her knuckles were white with tension, and her fingers were curved as if around a circular object. The missing object created a void in the composition that drew the eye compulsively, making the viewer acutely aware of what was not shown. As I stared at Margaret's portrait, I began to understand something that chilled me more than all the ledger entries combined. The chosen heirs had not been unwilling victims of some ancient curse. They had been willing participants who understood exactly what was being asked of them. The knowledge in their eyes was not confusion or fear, but acceptance. They had looked into the true nature of their family's arrangement and had chosen to fulfill their obligations rather than attempt escape. The realization sent me back to the library with new urgency, driven by a need to understand what could make such acceptance possible. What truth could be so terrible that death seemed preferable to resistance? What arrangement could inspire such absolute capitulation across multiple generations? The portraits had shown me the faces of the chosen, but they had also revealed something far more disturbing: the faces of people who had ceased fighting for their own survival. As I descended the stairs, the painted eyes seemed to follow my progress, and I found myself wondering if the artists who had created these works had truly understood what they were depicting. Had they painted the chosen heirs with such precision because they too had glimpsed the true nature of the Whitley family's bargain? Or had they simply been unusually skilled at capturing the particular expression that comes over a face when hope has been systematically abandoned? The questions multiplied as I returned to the library, but beneath them all lay a more immediate concern. If the chosen heirs had all accepted their fate with such apparent willingness, what had they learned that had made resistance seem impossible? And more urgently, what had Margaret Whitley discovered in those final days that had driven her to attempt escape where all others had submitted to whatever the arrangement demanded? Despite Thomas Hartwell's warning about the basement stairs, I found myself drawn downward as the afternoon light began to fail. Something in Margaret's final ledger entry, her mention of finding the original covenant, had lodged itself in my mind with the persistence of a splinter. The upper floors of the house had revealed the symptoms of the family's curse, but I was beginning to suspect that its cause lay deeper, in the foundations both literal and metaphorical upon which the Whitley fortune had been built. The basement door was located beneath the main staircase, secured with a lock that was notably more substantial than those protecting the rest of the house. When I found the appropriate key among those Hartwell had given me, it turned with surprising ease, as if it had been used recently. The door opened onto a wooden staircase that descended into darkness so complete it seemed to have physical weight. I had brought a flashlight, but its beam seemed inadequate against the pressing dark. The stairs creaked under my weight in a rhythm that suggested they were far older than the house above, built from timber that had been seasoned in an age when construction was as much craft as commerce. The air grew colder with each step, carrying scents that belonged more to earth and stone than to any domestic space. The basement was far more extensive than I had expected, stretching beyond the house's apparent footprint into chambers that had been carved directly from the bedrock. The walls were lined with fitted stone, the blocks so precisely joined that no mortar was visible between them. This was construction that predated the Georgian mansion above, work that suggested the house had been built not on empty land, but over something that had existed long before the first Whitley had arrived in Vermont. My flashlight beam revealed a central chamber perhaps 30 feet square, its ceiling supported by stone arches that gave the space the feel of a medieval crypt. But this was no burial vault. The floor was dominated by a circular design inlaid in what appeared to be silver, its pattern so complex that my eyes struggled to follow its geometry. At the circle's center stood a pedestal carved from black stone, its surface polished to mirror smoothness despite what must have been centuries of age. Around the chamber's perimeter, alcoves had been cut into the stone walls, each containing objects that seemed to pulse with their own dim light. I approached the nearest alcove cautiously, my flashlight revealing artifacts that belonged to no historical period I could identify. There were implements of metal that might have been tools, or might have been something else entirely, their purpose obscured by designs that hurt to look at directly. Books bound in materials that did not feel like leather, their pages covered with symbols that seemed to move when observed peripherally. But it was the pedestal at the room's center that drew me with gravitational inevitability. As I approached, my flashlight revealed that its polished surface was not empty, but marked with a single shallow depression, perfectly circular and perhaps 3 inches in diameter. The depression was stained with something that had long since dried to a rust-brown color, and around its rim, carved in letters so small they were barely visible, was text in a language I could not read. Beneath the pedestal, I discovered what Margaret Whitley must have found in her final desperate search for answers. A cavity had been carved into the stone, sealed with a metal plate that bore the same strange symbols I had seen on the books in the alcoves. The plate was hinged, and when I lifted it, the space beneath exhaled air so cold it made my breath visible in the flashlight beam. Inside the cavity was a leather portfolio, its binding cracked with age but still intact. When I lifted it out, the leather felt strangely warm against my hands, as if it had been recently handled. The portfolio contained a single document, written on parchment that was clearly far older than any of the family ledgers I had examined upstairs. This was the original covenant Margaret had mentioned, the foundational agreement that had bound the Whitley family to their terrible tradition. The document was written in English, but in the formal style of the late 18th century. Its language was precise to the point of legal pedantry, yet it described arrangements that no earthly court could ever enforce. I read it by flashlight in that stone chamber, and with each paragraph, I felt my understanding of the world shift in ways that could never be corrected. "Be it known," the covenant began, "that on this 15th day of September, in the year of our Lord 1822, Josiah Whitley, being of sound mind and desperate circumstance, does enter into arrangement with that entity which governs the spaces between certainty and dream. Said entity, in consideration of services to be rendered by the Whitley bloodline, agrees to provide such prosperity as shall elevate the family from their present reduced circumstances to a position of comfort and influence within their chosen community." The covenant went on to specify the terms of this arrangement with horrifying clarity. The entity, never named but referred to throughout as the benefactor, would ensure the family's financial success through means not specified, but guaranteed to be both effective and undetectable by conventional investigation. In exchange, the Whitley family agreed to provide what the document termed periodic offerings, to be selected through the sacred determination of chance. The selection, the covenant content, shall occur annually on the anniversary of this agreement, conducted according to the prescribed ritual and using the coin provided by the benefactor for this purpose. The chosen heir shall serve the benefactor's purposes for a period not to exceed 7 years. after which their obligations shall be considered fulfilled and their service complete. The family agrees that no attempt shall be made to interfere with the chosen heir's service or to break the covenant through any means earthly or otherwise. But it was the covenant's final paragraph that revealed the true horror of the Whitley arrangement. The benefactor makes known that the services required of the chosen heirs pertain to the maintenance of barriers that separate the world of common experience from realms of older and more terrible reality. The chosen serve as guardians of thresholds that must not be crossed, and their sacrifice ensures that certain doors remain closed to those who would open them in ignorance of the consequences. The Whitley family thus serves not only their own prosperity, but the safety of the wider world, though this service shall remain forever unrecognized and unrewarded save by the benefits provided herein. I lowered the document with hands that had begun to shake, finally understanding the true weight of what the family had been carrying for 2 centuries. The chosen heirs had not been victims but sentinels, their deaths not murders but necessary sacrifices that held back something far worse than any individual tragedy. Margaret Whitley had discovered that her family were not merely the unwilling servants of some malevolent entity, but the conscious guardians of boundaries that protected the world from horrors that existed beyond conventional understanding. As I stood in that stone chamber, surrounded by artifacts that belonged to no human civilization, I began to comprehend why each generation of chosen heirs had accepted their fate with such apparent willingness. They had learned what I was learning, that some responsibilities are too important to abandon, some burdens too necessary to cast aside. The Whitley family had been trapped not by malevolence but by necessity, bound to their covenant not by force, but by the terrible knowledge of what would happen if they failed to fulfill their obligations. The flashlight beam began to dim as I carefully returned the covenant to its hiding place, and in the growing darkness, I could swear I heard something stirring in the spaces between the stone arches. Whatever the Whitley heirs had been guarding against, it was still there, still waiting beyond whatever barriers their sacrifices had maintained. As I made my way back up the creaking stairs, I carried with me the weight of knowledge that could never be unlearned, and the growing suspicion that my own investigation had already drawn unwanted attention from the very forces the family had died to contain. Margaret Whitley's personal diary occupied a locked drawer in the library desk, its key hidden beneath a loose floorboard that bore signs of recent disturbance. The diary itself was a simple leather-bound journal, its pages filled with entries that chronicled her growing understanding of the family curse and her increasingly desperate attempts to find some means of escape. Reading her private thoughts felt like an invasion of the most profound kind, yet I found myself compelled to continue, driven by the need to understand what had driven the last of the Whitleys to attempt what all her predecessors had accepted as inevitable. The earliest entries, dating to 1985, showed Margaret in the role of dutiful family historian, working to organize the accumulated records of 2 centuries of Whitley succession. Her writing was precise and scholarly, displaying the kind of methodical approach that might have made her an excellent researcher under different circumstances. "I have begun the work of cataloging our family's papers," she wrote. "The ledgers provide a remarkable record of our history, though there are certain patterns in the succession that I cannot yet understand. Why do some heirs live for years after their selection, while others pass within months? What determines the duration of their service?" By 1986, her tone had begun to shift as she uncovered evidence of the true nature of the family arrangement. "I have found Father's private correspondence with the previous generation," she wrote. "His letters speak of obligations and arrangements in language that seems almost coded. He writes of services rendered and boundaries maintained, as if our family were engaged in some form of civil service rather than private inheritance. Most disturbing are his references to the vigil and the suggestion that the chosen heirs do not simply die, but are translated to their eternal posts." The entries from early 1987 showed Margaret in a state of increasing agitation as she began to comprehend the full scope of her family's situation. "I have been having dreams," she wrote, "or perhaps they are not dreams at all, but visions of where the chosen heirs go when they fulfill their obligations. I see them standing guard at doorways that open onto nothing, watching passages that lead to places that should not exist. They are not dead. They are transformed, made into something that can serve as eternal sentinels." The arrangement does not end with death but continues beyond it, and the chosen heirs spend eternity preventing something terrible from entering our world. Her handwriting became increasingly erratic as the September ceremony approached, and her entries took on the quality of someone grappling with knowledge that threatened to overwhelm her sanity. "I understand now why each generation accepts their fate so willingly," she wrote. "It is not resignation, but recognition. The chosen heirs see what lies beyond the barriers they are meant to guard, and they understand that their individual survival is insignificant compared to the protection of all humanity. But I cannot accept this. There must be another way, some method of fulfilling the arrangement without perpetuating this cycle of sacrifice." Margaret's final entries revealed the depth of her research into potential solutions. She had corresponded with scholars of folklore and occult history, seeking any precedent for breaking such ancient covenants. She had consulted with experts in contract law, hoping to find some loophole in the agreement her ancestor had signed. Most desperately, she had attempted to locate the mysterious coin that served as the instrument of selection, believing that its destruction might free the family from their obligation. "The coin is the key to everything," she wrote just days before her disappearance. "It is not merely a tool for random selection, but a conduit through which the benefactor exercises power over our family. I have searched every room, every hiding place, every conceivable location where such an object might be kept. Yet it appears only when needed, materializing for the ceremony and vanishing afterward as if it existed only partially in our reality." Her penultimate entry, dated September 13, 1987, showed Margaret in a state of desperate determination. "I have found references to the coin in Father's most private papers. He writes that it cannot be destroyed by any earthly means, but that it can be removed from the ceremony if the designated heir takes it beyond the boundaries of the estate before the selection can be completed. The heir must carry the coin away from the place of power, breaking the connection between the benefactor and the family. This act would not destroy the arrangement but would transfer its burden to whoever holds the coin, allowing the remaining family members to live free of the curse." The final entry, written in handwriting so agitated it was barely legible, contained Margaret's last recorded thoughts. "Tomorrow is September 15th, and I am the only remaining member of the family to participate in the ceremony. The coin appeared on my nightstand this morning, as it always does when the time approaches. It is exactly as the ledgers described, silver, ancient and warm to the touch despite being made of cold metal. When I hold it, I can feel the weight of 2 centuries of sacrifice, and I can hear whispers in languages that predate human speech. But I have made my choice. I will not submit to selection, for there is no one to select but myself. Instead, I will take the coin and leave this place forever, carrying the burden away from the estate and allowing the arrangement to die with me. If this diary is ever found, let it serve as evidence that the Whitley curse ended not with submission, but with defiance." The diary ended there, but Margaret's story did not. Scattered throughout her desk I found additional evidence of her final days. Maps of escape routes leading away from the estate, correspondence with distant relatives who might have offered shelter, and most heartbreakingly, a letter addressed to no one in particular explaining her decision to sacrifice herself for the freedom of any Whitley descendants who might survive in ignorance of their heritage. What I did not find was any indication that her plan had succeeded. According to the local newspaper, Margaret Whitley had vanished without a trace. Her car still parked beside the house, her belongings undisturbed. The most likely explanation was that the arrangement she had sought to break had claimed her just as it had claimed all the chosen heirs before her, that the benefactor would not be denied its due regardless of the heir's willingness to participate in the ceremony. Yet as I sat in the library reading her final words, I could not shake the feeling that Margaret's story remained unfinished. She had spoken of carrying the coin beyond the estate's boundaries. But what if she had succeeded only partially? What if she had managed to disrupt the ceremony without fully escaping the arrangement's power? The questions that Margaret's diary raised consumed my thoughts as darkness began to settle over the estate. I found myself pacing the library, turning her words over in my mind like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a complete picture. If she had succeeded in taking the coin beyond the estate's boundaries, why had her car remained behind? If she had failed, why was there no record of her death in the traditional manner described by the family ledgers? It was then, as I moved restlessly between the desk and the tall windows that looked out over the overgrown gardens, that I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. On the windowsill, partially hidden beneath a stack of genealogical charts, lay a small object that caught the last rays of daylight filtering through the dusty glass. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized what it was: a coin, silver and ancient, exactly as Margaret had described in her final diary entry. I approached it with the same caution one might show a venomous snake, aware that I was looking at an object that had determined the fate of generations. When I finally worked up the courage to pick it up, the coin felt warm against my palm despite the chill that had settled over the house. It was larger than a modern quarter but smaller than a silver dollar, its faces worn smooth by centuries of handling. On one side, I could barely make out the impression of a tree whose branches seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The other side bore symbols that hurt to look at, characters that belonged to no alphabet I had ever seen. The coin's presence on the windowsill suggested that Margaret had indeed attempted her desperate plan, but something had prevented her from carrying it beyond the estate's boundaries. Perhaps she had made it as far as the library before the coin's influence had overcome her will to resist. Or perhaps she had discovered, in those final moments, that the arrangement contained provisions she had not anticipated, safeguards that prevented the chosen heir from simply walking away with the instrument of their selection. As I held the coin, turning it over in my palm, I began to understand something that Margaret's research had not prepared her for. The coin was not merely a tool for random selection, it was a conduit, a focal point through which the benefactor could observe and influence events in our world. By taking possession of it, I had inadvertently placed myself within the arrangement's sphere of influence, making myself visible to forces that had been content to remain in the shadows as long as their covenant was respected. The realization came with a sensation of being watched, not by human eyes but by something far older and infinitely more patient. The library's shadows seemed to deepen despite the electric lights I had switched on, and the air itself felt thick with anticipation. I understood, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that I had crossed a line from which there might be no return. By taking up Margaret's investigation, by descending into the basement and reading the covenant, by now holding the coin that bound the family to their terrible obligation, I had made myself part of a story that was far from over. The sound that reached my ears then was like nothing I had ever heard, a rustling that might have been wind in leaves, except that there was no wind, and the sound came from inside the house rather than from the gardens beyond the windows. It was followed by footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the rooms above with the measured pace of someone conducting an inspection. But Thomas Hartwell had left hours ago, and I was certain that I was alone in the house. I stood frozen in the library, the coin growing warmer in my palm as the footsteps continued their circuit overhead. They moved from room to room with the familiarity of someone who knew the house intimately, pausing occasionally as if to examine something that required closer attention. When they reached the top of the main staircase, they stopped entirely, and in the silence that followed, I could feel the weight of attention focused on the library where I stood. The footsteps began to descend, and with each step the coin in my hand grew hotter until it was almost painful to hold. Yet I found myself unable to put it down, as if my fingers had forgotten how to open. The warmth spread up my arm and into my chest, carrying with it a strange sense of recognition, as if I were remembering something I had never actually experienced. When the footsteps reached the entrance hall, they stopped again, and I heard the sound of the library door opening despite the fact that I could see it clearly from where I stood, and it had not moved. Yet something had entered the room, not through the door, but around it, in the spaces between certainty and perception, where such things can move without regard for physical barriers. "You have been reading our family's history," said a voice that might have been Margaret's, though it carried undertones that no living throat could produce. "You have learned what we have carried, what we have sacrificed, what we have protected. Do you understand now why the arrangement cannot be broken?" I tried to speak but found that words had abandoned me. The coin had grown so hot that it seemed to be burning itself into my palm, yet I still could not release it. Around me the library began to change, its familiar dimensions shifting to accommodate presences that existed in more than 3 dimensions. The books on the shelves rearranged themselves, their spines now bearing titles in languages that predated human speech. The windows no longer looked out onto the Vermont countryside, but onto landscapes that existed in no earthly geography. Margaret thought she could carry our burden away from this place, the voice continued, and now I could see her, or something wearing her appearance, standing in the space between the desk and the window. She looked exactly as she had in her portrait, but her eyes held depths that belonged to someone who had seen beyond the boundaries of mortal experience. She believed that distance could break the covenant, that physical separation could sever spiritual bonds. She learned, as you are learning, that some arrangements transcend such simple limitations. The Margaret thing moved closer, and I could see that she was not quite solid, not quite real in the way that living people are real. She existed in the same liminal space as the coin, present in our world, but not entirely of it. "The chosen heirs do not die," she said, echoing what her diary had suggested. "They are translated, transformed into guardians who can stand watch at the boundaries between worlds. We serve willingly now because we have seen what lies beyond those boundaries, what would pour through if our vigil ever ended." I finally found my voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "What do you want from me?" Margaret's shade smiled with infinite sadness. "We want what we have always wanted, for the arrangement to continue, for the barriers to hold, for the world to remain safe from truths it cannot bear to know. You have made yourself part of our story by taking up the coin. The question now is whether you will accept the responsibility that comes with that choice, or whether you will force us to find other means of ensuring your compliance." The coin in my palm had grown so hot that I expected to see flames, yet it produced no visible fire. Instead, it seemed to be burning away my resistance, my ability to deny what I was seeing and hearing. Through its heat, I could feel the presence of every chosen heir who had come before, all of them standing guard at doorways I hoped never to see, all of them watching me with eyes that held centuries of willing sacrifice. "The ceremony approaches," Margaret said, though I had no idea what she meant by that. "September 15th comes again, as it always does, and the coin seeks a new bearer. You may not be a Whitley by blood, but you have made yourself one by choice. The arrangement recognizes no distinction between birth and assumption when it comes to those who would serve the greater purpose." The revelation that I had somehow inherited the Whitley obligation by taking possession of the coin filled me with a terror that was both immediate and existential. I was not merely an observer of their family history, but had become, through my own actions, the latest chapter in a story that stretched back 2 centuries. Yet even as Margaret's shade spoke of ceremonies and responsibilities, a part of my mind continued to function with academic precision, cataloging details and seeking understanding even in the face of supernatural horror. "The bloodline does not end with my transformation," Margaret continued, her translucent form moving with the fluid grace of someone no longer bound by physical limitations. "There are others, cousins and distant relatives who carry Whitley blood in their veins without knowledge of what that inheritance truly means. They live ordinary lives in ordinary places, ignorant of the covenant that binds them to something far greater and more terrible than mere wealth." She gestured toward the genealogical charts scattered across the desk, documents that I now realized contained more than historical interest. "I spent my final years mapping every branch of our family tree, tracing the bloodline through marriages and migrations, through name changes and deliberate concealments. What I discovered was both comforting and horrifying. The Whitley blood has spread far beyond this estate, carried by descendants who escaped before they could be claimed by the arrangement." I forced myself to speak despite the coin's burning presence in my palm. "Then why continue the ceremony at all? If there are other heirs, why not let them live in ignorance?" Margaret's expression grew infinitely sad, because ignorance is not protection when the barriers begin to weaken. The arrangement exists not for our benefit but for the safety of all humanity. Each ceremony strengthens the seals that keep certain doors closed. Each sacrifice reinforces the barriers that prevent incursion from realms that should never touch our world. If the ceremonies ended, if the chosen heirs ceased their vigil, those barriers would eventually fail, and what lies beyond them would pour through like water through a broken dam. The genealogical charts on the desk began to glow with soft light, revealing names and connections that had been invisible in ordinary illumination. I could see the branching lines of inheritance spreading across the country, touching lives in ways their bearers could never suspect. Children in suburban schools, professionals in office buildings, retirees in quiet communities, all of them carrying genetic echoes of the original covenant, all of them potential candidates for selection, should the need arise. The coin chooses not randomly, but according to need, Margaret explained, noticing the direction of my gaze. It seeks those who can serve, those whose circumstances and character make them suitable for the transformation that guardianship requires. Sometimes it chooses from the main bloodline, sometimes from distant branches. Occasionally, as with you, it chooses someone who has made themselves part of the story through their own actions. I thought of my comfortable life as a genealogist, my apartment filled with research materials and historical documents, my quiet routine of archive visits and academic conferences. All of that seemed impossibly distant now, belonging to someone who had existed before taking up the burden of knowledge that could never be set down. What if I refuse? I asked, though even as I spoke the words I knew they were meaningless. Refusal is always possible, Margaret said gently. The arrangement has never operated through force but through understanding. Each chosen heir comes to comprehend what is at stake, what their sacrifice protects, what would happen if they chose personal survival over universal safety. Most choose service willingly once they fully grasp the consequences of abandonment. The library around us continued its transformation, becoming less a room in a Vermont mansion and more a nexus point where multiple realities intersected. Through the changing windows, I caught glimpses of the other guardians at their posts, shadowy figures standing at doorways that opened onto chaos, sentinels maintaining eternal vigilance against incursions from spaces between spaces. They had once been ordinary people like myself, drawn into the arrangement through curiosity or circumstance, transformed by choice into something far more necessary and far more terrible. The living Whitley descendants need not know about their heritage unless they are chosen, Margaret continued. They can live full lives, raise families, pursue careers, experience all the joys and sorrows that come with ordinary human existence. Only when the coin selects them do they learn the truth about what they carry in their blood, what responsibilities come with their genetic inheritance. I found myself thinking about those innocent relatives, wondering if they had ever experienced strange dreams or unexplained sensations, if some part of them sensed the weight of ancestral obligation they carried without understanding. Did they feel drawn to genealogical research as I had been? Did they find themselves fascinated by family histories and ancient traditions without knowing why? The thought that my own investigation might have been guided by forces beyond conscious decision was deeply unsettled.
Ling.
How many are there? I asked, looking at the illuminated charts that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. 17 that I was able to trace, Margaret replied. Perhaps others that escaped my research. They scattered after the generation that fled the estate in the 1920s, spreading across the continent and beyond. Most have no knowledge of Vermont, no awareness that their prosperity, for they tend to be prosperous, as the arrangement provides for all who carry the blood, comes with obligations they have never been asked to fulfill. The coin in my palm had begun to feel less like a burning coal and more like a living thing, pulsing with rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Through its warmth, I could sense the presence of those distant relatives, could feel the threads of connection that bound them to the covenant their ancestor had signed. Some were closer than others. A few might be drawn to investigation as I had been, while others would live and die without ever suspecting the truth about their lineage. The ceremony approaches, Margaret said again, and this time I understood that she was not speaking metaphorically. September 15th was still months away according to my calendar, but time operated differently within the arrangement's influence. The ceremony existed in a space outside normal chronology, occurring whenever the barriers needed reinforcement, whenever a new guardian was required to take up the vigil. What happens during the ceremony? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Margaret's form began to fade slightly, as if the effort of maintaining her presence in our reality was becoming too great. You will understand when the time comes, she said. The coin will guide you, as it has guided all who came before. Trust in the arrangement, trust in the necessity of what you are being asked to do. Remember that your sacrifice serves something far greater than any individual life, something more important than personal desires or fears. As her shade disappeared entirely, leaving me alone in the library with only the coin's weight as evidence that our conversation had been real, I found myself grappling with questions that had no comfortable answers. Had I truly chosen this fate, or had the arrangement somehow guided my steps from the moment I first read about the Whitley family? Was my academic interest in genealogy genuine, or had it been a subtle form of supernatural manipulation designed to lead me to this moment? The genealogical charts on the desk had returned to their ordinary appearance, but I could still sense the hidden connections they contained, the web of bloodline and obligation that stretched across continents and generations. Somewhere out there, 17 people lived their lives in ignorance of what they might be called upon to sacrifice. And now, through my own choices and actions, I had become the 18th, bound to an arrangement that transcended any normal understanding of family, duty, or survival. The drive back to my own life, my apartment, my research, my carefully ordered existence, felt like moving through a world made of paper and shadows. Everything I had once considered solid and reliable now seemed insubstantial, temporary, a facade constructed to hide truths too terrible for ordinary consciousness to bear. The coin remained with me, not in my pocket or bag where I might have consciously placed it, but somehow integrated into my being in ways that defied physical explanation. I could feel its presence constantly, a warm weight that pulsed with alien purpose. In the weeks that followed my return from Vermont, I attempted to resume normal life with the desperate determination of someone trying to convince themselves that reality remained unchanged. I returned to my genealogical research, accepted new clients, attended academic conferences, maintained the routines that had once provided structure and meaning. Yet beneath the surface of normalcy, I was acutely aware that I was merely waiting. For what, I could not say, but the waiting itself had become the dominant fact of my existence. The dreams began almost immediately, not the chaotic fragments of ordinary sleep, but vivid, coherent experiences that felt more real than waking life. I found myself standing in places that could not exist, watching doorways that opened onto impossible geometries, observing the eternal vigil that the chosen heirs maintained at the boundaries between worlds. I saw Margaret there, and Samuel, and Catherine, and all the others whose portraits I had studied in the Whitley mansion. They acknowledged my presence with subtle nods, welcoming me into their ranks with the quiet satisfaction of soldiers recognizing a new recruit. But it was not only the chosen heirs that populated these dreams. I began to glimpse the living descendants as well, the 17 souls who carried Whitley blood without knowledge of its implications. They appeared to me as brief flashes in the darkness, a woman in Seattle researching her family's immigration records, a man in Toronto who collected antique coins without understanding why they fascinated him, a child in Denver who drew pictures of trees with impossible geometries. Each glimpse reinforced my growing understanding that the arrangement was not merely a historical curiosity, but a living system that continued to operate across generations and continents. My waking hours were filled with research that I told myself was academic but knew was something far more personal. I traced genealogical lines with obsessive precision, following paper trails that led from Vermont to California, from Maine to Texas, mapping the diaspora of Whitley blood through 2 centuries of American expansion. What I discovered was both miraculous and terrifying. The descendants had indeed prospered, each family line marked by unusual success in business, arts, or academia. The arrangement's promise of prosperity had followed them wherever they went, ensuring that they lived comfortable lives even as they remained ignorant of the price that comfort ultimately demanded. I found myself keeping detailed records of their movements, their achievements, their families. A successful architect in Portland whose buildings seemed to exist in perfect harmony with their surroundings. A renowned historian in Charleston whose work on colonial America revealed insights that seemed to come from sources unavailable to other scholars. A children's book author in Minneapolis whose stories contained images and themes that suggested access to mythologies far older than any known folklore. All of them successful, all of them creative, all of them unknowingly touched by the same supernatural influence that had shaped their family's destiny for generations. The moral weight of this knowledge became increasingly unbearable. Should I contact these innocent people, warn them about the heritage they carried in their blood? Or would such contact only serve to draw the arrangement's attention to them, marking them for selection when they might otherwise live and die in blessed ignorance? The coin's warm presence offered no guidance on such questions, pulsing with steady patience as if content to let me wrestle with decisions that had no correct answers. As autumn approached, not the calendar autumn of ordinary time, but the symbolic season that marked the arrangement's annual renewal, I began to experience phenomena that confirmed my transformation from observer to participant. Objects would appear in my apartment, old books written in languages I could not read but somehow understood, documents that detailed other families bound to similar covenants, maps showing locations where the barriers between worlds had grown thin. Each new addition to my collection arrived without explanation, materializing in places where they could not logically have been placed. More disturbing were the visitors, not physical beings who knocked on my door or called on the telephone, but presences that occupied the spaces between perception and reality. I would catch glimpses of figures in my peripheral vision, always gone when I turned to look directly at them. Conversations would drift through my apartment at night, conducted in voices that belonged to no living speakers, discussing matters that touched on cosmic responsibilities and ancient obligations. I never felt threatened by these visitations, but rather welcomed, as if I were being gradually inducted into a community that existed beyond normal human experience. The true nature of my situation became clear during a research trip to the Library of Congress, where I had gone seeking documents related to early Vermont settlement patterns. While examining colonial land grants in the manuscript reading room, I discovered a file that should not have existed, a collection of papers related to families who had entered into alternative arrangements for prosperity and protection during the uncertain years of American expansion. The Whitleys were mentioned, but they were not alone. Dozens of other families had made similar bargains with entities that remained unnamed but whose influence could be traced through generations of unusual success and periodic tragedy. Reading these documents, I understood that the Whitley arrangement was not unique, but part of a larger system, a network of covenants that maintained stability between our world and others that pressed against its boundaries. Each family served as guardians at different points along the cosmic perimeter, their chosen heirs standing watch at specific doorways, their sacrifices reinforcing barriers that kept unimaginable horrors from overwhelming human reality. The arrangement I had inherited was not merely a family curse, but a cosmic responsibility, a duty that transcended personal concerns and individual survival. That evening, as I sat in my apartment surrounded by documents that detailed 2 centuries of supernatural obligation, I finally understood what Margaret Whitley had meant when she wrote about duties that were impossible to fulfill and impossible to escape. The arrangement was impossible to fulfill because it demanded eternal vigilance, endless sacrifice, continuous renewal. Yet it was equally impossible to escape because the consequences of abandonment extended far beyond any individual family, threatening the very foundations of ordered reality. The coin grew warm in my awareness as I reached this understanding, and I realized that my period of waiting was drawing to a close. Somewhere in the network of Whitley descendants, others were beginning to dream the dreams I had been experiencing, beginning to feel the pull of ancestral obligation they had never known they carried. The ceremony was approaching, not in calendar time, but in the deeper rhythms that governed the arrangement's operation. And choices would need to be made about who would answer the call and who would be allowed to continue living in ignorance. As I write these words, I can feel the weight of 17 lives hanging in the balance, 17 souls who may soon learn that their prosperity has always come with conditions they never agreed to accept. I think of the woman in Seattle with her immigration records, the man in Toronto with his coin collection, the child in Denver with her impossible drawings. I wonder which of them will be chosen, which will be called to join the eternal vigil that protects a world that will never know their names or understand their sacrifice. The arrangement continues, as it has continued for 2 centuries, as it will continue for centuries to come. The barriers hold because people choose to hold them, because in each generation someone accepts the terrible responsibility of standing guard at doorways that must never be opened. We are not victims but volunteers, not prisoners but sentinels, not the cursed but the consecrated. And in my pocket, though I have no pocket, a silver coin grows warm with patient anticipation, waiting for the moment when choice becomes certainty, when academic interest transforms into existential commitment, when the observer becomes the observed and the story claims another willing participant in its eternal necessary horror. The gamble continues. The coin spins through dimensions that have no names, and somewhere, in 17 different cities across a continent that has never truly been safe, people who carry ancient blood in their veins pause in their daily routines, touched by dreams they cannot quite remember, and drawn toward discoveries they do not yet know they need to make. The inheritance continues, as it always has, as it always must.